The crack of Henry Dalton's whip cut through Georgia's pre-dawn darkness like a prayer answered by the devil himself. Blood still stained the leather from yesterday's work. This is the story of how one man turned human hunting into an art form that would terrorize the antebellum South for over 2 decades. The year was 1809, and the cotton fields of Burke County stretched endlessly under a sky the color of old pewter. Dalton rode his black stallion along the plantation boundaries, his pale eyes scanning tree lines for movement that didn't belong. At 32, he had already earned a reputation that made overseers whisper his name like an incantation. When enslaved people vanished into the night, plantation owners didn't call the sheriff. They called Henry Dalton. The morning air carried the scent of magnolia blossoms, and something else, the metallic tang of fear that seemed to follow wherever Dalton's horse had stepped. Spanish moss draped from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, and beneath their branches, the earth felt soft from recent rains. But Dalton's attention, fixed on harder ground, where boot prints pressed into red clay told stories of desperate flight. Before we descend deeper into this chapter of American darkness, I want to know, where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next has been buried in county records for over 2 centuries. The Whitfield Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime cotton land, where Judge Samuel Whitfield ruled over 200 enslaved souls with the same iron grip he used in his courtroom. That September morning, he paced his study like a caged animal, his normally composed demeanor shattered by news that 3 of his most valuable workers had vanished during the night shift. The judge's mahogany desk bore the scars of his riding crop, struck in frustration as dawn revealed empty quarters and broken chains. Dalton's reputation had been forged in moments like these. Unlike the bumbling county sheriffs who chased shadows through swampland, he understood that hunting humans required different skills than tracking deer. He studied their patterns, their relationships, their fears. Most importantly, he understood that terror was his most effective weapon. From the Burke County Courthouse records, September 14, 1809. H. Dalton engaged for recovery of property. Standard rate plus incentive for example making. Judge S. Whitfield presiding. The hunter dismounted at the slave quarters, his boots striking packed earth with deliberate force. The remaining workers kept their eyes downcast as he moved between their cabins, but Dalton could read the tension in their shoulders, the careful way they breathed. Someone knew where the runaways had gone. Someone always knew. He stopped before an elderly woman named Celia, who sat mending clothes with fingers that trembled just slightly. Her weathered hands had seen 60 years of bondage, and Dalton recognized the particular stillness of someone trying to become invisible. 3 young bucks don't just sprout wings, Dalton said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl that made his threats sound almost conversational. Someone saw which way they flew. Celia's needle never paused in its rhythm, but her breathing changed. Dalton smiled, the expression never reaching his pale eyes. He'd found his starting point. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that clung to the Ogeechee River. Somewhere in that vast network of waterways and pine forests, 3 men ran toward a freedom that existed only in whispered stories. They had perhaps 6 hours before Dalton's real work began. But what none of them understood yet was that Henry Dalton never hunted alone. How far would you run, knowing something like this was coming for you? Because by sunset, the Georgia wilderness would echo with sounds that would haunt Burke County for generations to come. Dalton's hunting dogs emerged from the kennel like demons answering a summons, their brindle coats rippling with muscle beneath scars from previous hunts. These weren't ordinary tracking hounds. They'd been trained specifically to hunt human prey, and their success rate was written in the terror of every plantation in eastern Georgia. The kennel sat behind Dalton's modest farmhouse, where the air hung thick with the smell of wet fur, blood-soaked earth, and something else, the particular musk of animals that had tasted human fear. The wooden fence posts bore claw marks 6 inches deep, scratched by creatures that paced endlessly between hunts. Even in daylight, shadows seemed to pool unnaturally around the enclosure, as if darkness itself had taken up residence there. Dalton selected 3 from his pack of 12. Rex, a massive bloodhound whose scarred muzzle told stories of violent encounters. Brutus, a pit bull mix whose jaw could crush bone with casual efficiency. And most terrifying of all, Tracker, a lean cur whose yellow eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human and utterly without mercy. The hunter's methodology revealed itself in these choices. Rex would follow the scent trail with mechanical precision. Brutus would corner and hold the quarry through brute force. But Tracker would break their spirit long before the chase ended. From Dalton's personal ledger, discovered in 1893, September 14th, 3 bucks from Whitfield. Started with Celia's boy. Always start with the weak links. The elderly woman's grandson, barely 16, had lasted less than 10 minutes under Dalton's questioning. Not through violence, that came later, but through the slow, methodical description of what happened to runaways who forced him to track them down. The boy's resolve crumbled like wet paper when Dalton began detailing the fate of the last fugitive he'd retrieved. Marcus had been his name. 23 years old, strong as an ox, clever enough to evade capture for 6 days. Dalton found him hiding in a cypress swamp, half dead from infected wounds and swamp fever. The hunter could have returned him alive. The reward was the same, either way. Instead, he'd made an example. Death stalks through morning mist. The boy told Dalton everything. How the 3 men, Samuel, Joshua, and Big Jim, had planned their escape for months. How they'd hidden supplies in the old tobacco barn. How they intended to follow the Ogeechee River north toward the savannah, where rumors spoke of ship captains who asked no questions about a man's papers. Most importantly, the boy revealed their fatal mistake. They'd taken horses. Dalton smiled as he saddled his stallion. Horses left deeper tracks, required water more frequently, and couldn't navigate the dense underbrush where humans might disappear. The fugitives had traded stealth for speed, not understanding that in Dalton's game, speed without strategy meant nothing. The trail led northeast from the plantation, following old logging roads that cut through pine forests thick enough to swallow sound. Dalton rode with practiced patience, his dogs ranging ahead on long leads, their noses pressed to earth that still held the scent of stolen horses and desperate men. The September heat was building, and he knew the runaways would need water soon. But what the 3 men didn't know was that Dalton had been preparing for exactly this scenario. For 2 years, he'd been mapping every water source, every potential hiding place, every route north through Burke County. He'd placed caches of supplies at strategic points, recruited informants among the free black communities, even bribed river pilots to report unusual activity. The plantation system had created Henry Dalton, but he'd transformed himself into something far more dangerous. A man who understood that terror was a renewable resource, growing stronger with each successful hunt. At 11:30 that morning, the dogs found the first campsite, ashes from a hastily extinguished fire, horse droppings still warm, the impression in pine needles where 3 men had rested for perhaps an hour. They were following the river, just as the boy had revealed, but their tracks showed increasing desperation. One horse was already favoring its left front leg. Another bore the double weight of riders, suggesting someone had been injured. Most telling of all, they'd abandoned their careful pace for headlong flight, leaving a trail a child could follow. Dalton studied the signs with professional interest, calculating distance and time like a mathematician working an equation. The fugitives had perhaps 3 hours led, but they were pushing their animals too hard. At this rate, the horses would be useless by nightfall. He remounted and urged his stallion forward, the dogs bounding ahead with renewed enthusiasm. Their quarry's scent grew stronger with each mile. Carried on wind that whispered through pine boughs, like secrets shared among the damned. But as the hunter closed the distance between himself and the three men who dared to claim their freedom, he failed to notice something crucial. Other eyes watched from the forest shadows, and not all of them belonged to woodland creatures. What would you do if you witnessed what was coming next? Because scattered throughout these woods were people who'd faced this choice before, and their decisions would determine whether Henry Dalton's reputation grew even darker or whether someone would finally make him pay for the blood on his hands. Three figures crouched motionless in the underbrush, their dark skin helping them blend with shadows that pooled beneath towering pines. These weren't random witnesses to Dalton's hunt. They were members of a network that had been watching the hunter for months, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The forest floor beneath them felt spongy with decades of fallen needles, releasing the sharp scent of resin and decay with each careful movement. Somewhere in the distance, Dalton's dogs bayed with increasing excitement, their voices echoing through trees that had witnessed too much blood. The September heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket, but the three watchers remained perfectly still, their breathing controlled and silent. The leader was a man called Moses, though that wasn't the name his mother had given him. 43 years old, bearing the keloid scars of a dozen whippings across his back, he'd escaped from a Savannah rice plantation 7 years earlier. Unlike most runaways who fled north, Moses had stayed in Georgia, building a network of safe houses and allies among the free black communities. He understood something that most fugitives didn't. Sometimes the best place to hide was in plain sight. Beside him crouched Ruth, a woman whose gentle appearance masked a mind that calculated violence with the precision of an engineer. She'd lost her husband to Dalton's dogs 2 years ago, found his body stripped and mutilated as a warning to others. Since then, she dedicated her life to learning everything about the hunter's methods, his routes, his weaknesses. The third figure was barely 18, a boy called David, whose parents had purchased their freedom and settled on a small farm near the Ogeechee, technically free. But freedom meant nothing when men like Dalton roamed the countryside. The boy carried a musket older than he was, its stock worn smooth by countless hands. More importantly, he carried something Dalton had never encountered in all his years of hunting. He carried no fear. Blood calls to blood, eventually. From Ruth's coded journal, recovered in 1912, the hunter follows patterns. Dogs first, then corners, then the example making. But patterns can become traps. The network had been tracking Dalton's movements for 8 months, mapping his routes, timing his hunts, studying the aftermath of his work. They discovered something that even Judge Whitfield didn't know. Dalton kept trophies. In a shed behind his farmhouse, preserved in jars and mounted on boards, were pieces of every runaway he'd killed. Fingers, ears, sometimes entire hands. A museum of terror that he visited nightly, like a priest tending his unholy shrine. But Moses had learned something else during his reconnaissance. Dalton always hunted alone with his dogs during the initial chase. He relied on fear and reputation to do half the work before he ever caught up to his quarry. That confidence had kept him alive for over a decade, but it had also created his blind spot. The baying grew closer. Through the trees, they could see movement. Dalton's black stallion picking its way along the riverbank, the rider sitting easy in the saddle, with the casual confidence of a man who'd never failed at his chosen profession. The three dogs ranged ahead, their noses locked on the scent trail that would lead them to Samuel, Joshua, and Big Jim. What the hunter didn't see were the ropes stretched between trees at horse height, nearly invisible in the forest gloom. He didn't notice the carefully placed branches that would force his mount toward a specific path. Most critically, he didn't sense the trap closing around him, like the jaws of his own dogs. Ruth raised her hand, fingers spread. The signal meant, wait. Let him pass. Let him think he's still the predator. But David's muscles tensed, his young face twisted with an anger that burned like fever. His family had lived in terror of this man for years, checking their doors twice each night, teaching their children to hide at the first sound of hoofbeats. The boy's finger tightened on his musket's trigger, and Moses saw the decision forming in his eyes. The network had planned this for months. Every detail calculated, every contingency considered. They would follow Dalton until he caught up with the 3 runaways, then strike when he was distracted by his kill. Clean, efficient, with the hunter's own methods turned against him, David was about to ruin everything. The boy rose from his crouch, musket lifting toward Dalton's approaching figure. In another few seconds, the shot would ring out. The hunter would fall, but the dogs would scatter, and the carefully orchestrated plan would collapse into chaos. Worse, if David missed, Dalton would turn his attention from the fleeing slaves to hunting the hunters. Moses moved like lightning, his scarred hand clamping over David's mouth while his other arm locked around the boy's chest. The musket swung wild, its barrel pointing harmlessly toward the canopy. For a moment, the 3 figures wrestled silently in the underbrush, their struggle masked by the sound of Dalton's horse passing 20 yards away. Ruth pressed her face close to David's ear, her whisper barely audible above the forest sounds. "He dies today, but we do this right, or we all die with him." The boy's muscles slowly relaxed, his breathing steadied. Moses released him carefully, ready to grab him again if the fever took hold. But David nodded, his young face set with new understanding. This wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. Not just their own, but for every person who might face Dalton's dogs in the future. The hunter disappeared around a bend in the river, his dogs' voices fading into the distance. But the trap was still intact, still waiting. Moses smiled grimly as he checked his own weapon, a knife whose blade had been sharpened to a razor's edge. Henry Dalton had built his reputation on the belief that fear was his greatest weapon, but he'd never faced people who had moved beyond fear into something far more dangerous. They had nothing left to lose. What would you choose? The safety of hiding, or the risk of fighting back against a monster who terrorized your community for years? Because 3 miles ahead, where the Ogeechee curved through a stand of cypress trees, Dalton was about to corner his quarry and discover that some hunts end with the hunter becoming the hunted. Samuel's horse collapsed into the muddy shallows with a sound like breaking bones, foam streaming from its nostrils as exhaustion finally claimed it. The 3 fugitives had pushed their animals beyond endurance, and now they faced the swamp on foot, with Dalton's baying hounds growing closer by the minute. The cypress grove rose around them like cathedral pillars, their massive trunks disappearing into Spanish moss that hung thick as burial shrouds. The air here tasted of decay and stagnant water, while beneath their feet, the ground gave way to knee-deep mud that sucked at their boots with each desperate step. Somewhere in the canopy above, a hawk screamed, or perhaps it was something else entirely, something that had learned to mimic the sounds of dying things. Big Jim helped Joshua drag Samuel from the collapsed horse, the injured man's left shoulder hanging at an unnatural angle from when they'd crashed through a deadfall 2 miles back. Blood seeped through his torn shirt, and his breathing came in sharp gasps that spoke of broken ribs. They were trapped between the deep water of the Ogeechee and the impenetrable wall of thorns that marked the swamp's eastern edge. Joshua pressed his back against a cypress trunk, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. At 26, he was the youngest of the 3, but his eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd already accepted death. "We ain't getting out of here," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of water lapping against rotted logs. The dogs' voices changed pitch, shifting from the steady bay of pursuit to the sharp, excited yipping that meant they'd found something fresh. Through the trees, they could hear Dalton's voice calling commands, though his words were lost in the swamp's acoustic maze. Big Jim, whose real name was James Washington, stood 6 feet 4 inches and weighed close to 250 pounds. His hands, scarred from years in Judge Whitfield's cotton fields, could snap a man's neck without effort. But even he understood that strength meant nothing against trained hunting dogs and their master's rifle. Fear tastes like copper pennies. From a letter found in Joshua's effects. Mama, if you reading this, then I ain't coming home. Tell Mary, I tried to be free for her and the baby both. The letter had been written 3 days earlier, before they'd stolen the horses, before they'd committed to this desperate flight toward freedom. Joshua had given it to his cousin, with instructions to deliver it only if he didn't return within a week. The young man had understood, even then, that this was likely a one-way journey. Samuel tried to stand, his good arm gripping Big Jim's shoulder for support. "Leave me," he gasped, blood flecking his lips. "Y'all still got a chance if you go now." But they all knew better. Dalton's reputation was built on the certainty of his hunts. In over 2 decades of slave catching, he'd never lost a quarry. More importantly, he'd never brought one back alive when he could make a more profitable example of their corpse. The sound of splashing grew closer. Through breaks in the moss, they could see movement, a dark shape moving with deliberate care through the shallows. Dalton had dismounted and was approaching on foot, leaving his horse on solid ground, while his dogs ranged ahead through the cypress roots. Rex appeared first, his massive head breaking the surface 30 yards away, like some prehistoric beast rising from primordial waters. The bloodhound's eyes locked onto the 3 men, and his bay changed to the deep, bone-chilling howl that meant the hunt was nearly over. Brutus emerged from a different direction, cutting off their retreat toward deeper water. The pit bull's scarred muzzle pulled back in a silent snarl, revealing teeth stained yellow with old blood. But it was Tracker who struck true terror into their hearts. The lean cur seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves, his yellow eyes holding an intelligence that was almost human. Dalton's voice cut through the swamp air with casual authority. "Samuel, Joshua, Big Jim." The hunter knew their names, had probably studied their histories, their families, their fears. "Y'all made this harder than it needed to be. Could have stayed put, lived quiet lives. Now you've forced my hand." The 3 men pressed closer together, their backs against the massive cypress. Samuel's breathing had grown labored, his injured shoulder preventing him from raising his arms. Joshua clutched a broken branch like a weapon, though they all knew it would be useless against trained attack dogs. But Big Jim was studying the water around them, his eyes tracking the subtle currents that flowed between the cypress knees. Something his grandmother had taught him as a child, before Judge Whitfield had purchased him at auction. "Swamp water always knows where it's going," she'd said. "Follow the flow, and it'll take you somewhere safe." The current was moving north, toward the main channel of the Ogeechee. If they could reach the river, if they could somehow get past Dalton's dogs, there might still be a chance. The hunter was confident, moving slowly, savoring the moment before the kill. That confidence might be the only weapon they had left. "You boys ready to come quiet?" Dalton called, his voice growing closer. "Make this easy on yourselves. I'll be quick about it." Samuel straightened against the tree, his good hand finding Joshua's shoulder. "My mama always said dying ain't the worst thing can happen to a man," he whispered. "Living as a slave is worse." Through the cypress grove, they could see Dalton now, his pale eyes scanning the shadows with practiced efficiency. His rifle hung loose in his hands, and his movements held the casual confidence of a man who'd never failed at his chosen profession. But what the hunter couldn't see, hidden in the Spanish moss above his head, were the 3 figures who'd been tracking him for the past hour. Moses, Ruth, and David had moved through the canopy like ghosts, using skills learned in childhood to navigate the aerial highways of the swamp. The trap was finally ready to spring. What would you do, knowing that 3 innocent men were about to die while their would-be rescuers watched from above? Because in the next few minutes, Henry Dalton would discover that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, and sometimes justice wears the face of those who've been pushed beyond the breaking point of human endurance. Moses dropped from the cypress canopy like divine retribution, his knife finding the space between Dalton's shoulder blades before the hunter could turn. But Henry Dalton had survived 2 decades of hunting humans by never making the mistake of thinking he was invincible. The blade struck leather instead of flesh, a thick hunting vest that Dalton wore beneath his shirt, reinforced with strips of metal that had saved his life more than once. The impact sent him stumbling forward into knee-deep water, but he kept his grip on the rifle and rolled aside as Moses crashed into the swamp behind him. The hunter's pale eyes found his attacker immediately, taking in the scarred face, the desperate determination, the knife that gleamed with swamp water instead of blood. "Well, well," Dalton said, his voice carrying that same lazy drawl that had terrified Burke County for years. "Moses Freeman, ain't it? Thought you'd learned your lesson after what happened to your woman." Ruth dropped next, landing on solid ground near the cypress where the 3 fugitives huddled. Her appearance sent a shock of recognition through Joshua's face. She was his aunt, his father's sister, who'd vanished from the Turner plantation 3 years ago. Everyone assumed she'd been caught and killed. Instead, she'd been planning. "Move to the deep water," she whispered urgently to the 3 men. "When the shooting starts, you swim for the main channel. Don't look back." But Big Jim was staring at something else. David, the youngest of their would-be rescuers, still crouched in the moss above with his ancient musket trained on Dalton's back. The boy's hands shook with adrenaline and inexperience, and his positioning was all wrong. If he fired from that angle, he was more likely to hit Moses than the hunter. Vengeance has many faces. Dalton's dogs had been trained for moments like this. At his whistle, they spread out in a semicircle, cutting off escape routes while keeping clear of their master's line of fire. Rex's massive head swung between Moses and the fugitives, calculating which threat to engage first. Brutus held position near the deeper water, his scarred muzzle pulled back in a permanent snarl. But it was Tracker who proved most dangerous. The lean cur had disappeared entirely, melting into the shadows like smoke. 20 years I've been doing this work," Dalton continued, his rifle now trained on Moses, while his eyes tracked the other threats. "You think you're the first ones tried to turn hunter into hunted? Ask the Blackwood boys how that worked out for them." Moses had heard that story. The Blackwood brothers, 3 freed slaves who'd tried to ambush Dalton in 1805. The hunter had left their bodies hanging from trees along the main road, a warning that lasted until the crows picked the bones clean. But Moses also knew something Dalton didn't. This wasn't 1805, and they weren't the Blackwood brothers. They'd spent months planning this, studying every aspect of the hunter's methods, preparing for contingencies he'd never faced. Ruth pulled a second knife from her boot, its blade blackened with something that wasn't rust. "You killed my husband, Henry," she said, her voice steady as riverstone. "Cut him up like meat and left the pieces where his children could find them." "Man shouldn't run if he can't face the consequences," Dalton replied. But something in his tone had changed. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and for the first time in his career, facing people who'd moved beyond fear into something far more dangerous. The shot came from an unexpected direction. Not David's musket, but a pistol fired by Big Jim, who'd found the weapon in Dalton's saddlebags when the hunter had dismounted. The bullet took Rex in the shoulder, spinning the massive bloodhound into the water with a yelp of pain and surprise. Chaos erupted in the cypress grove. Dalton's rifle barked, the shot going wide as Moses lunged forward with his knife. Ruth threw her blackened blade end over end, the weapon spinning through Spanish moss to strike Brutus in the haunches. The pit bull's attack charge turned into a tumbling splash that sent water geysering toward the canopy. But Tracker had been waiting for exactly this moment. The cur came from behind, his leap perfectly timed to catch Joshua as the young man tried to wade toward deeper water. 70 pounds of trained killer hit him between the shoulder blades, driving him face first into the murky shallows. David finally fired his musket, the ancient weapon belching smoke and flame. The shot struck a cypress trunk 6 inches from Dalton's head, sending bark exploding in all directions. The boy's inexperience had saved the hunter's life, but it had also revealed his position. Dalton's second shot found its mark. David pitched forward from his perch in the moss, his body crashing through branches before hitting the water with a splash that seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. Ruth screamed, a sound that contained 20 years of loss, rage, and desperation. The boy had been like a son to her, the future she'd been fighting to protect. Now, he floated face down in water that was turning red with his blood. Moses reached Dalton just as the hunter was reloading, his knife finding the gap between vest and shirt. This time, the blade bit deep, opening a gash across the man's ribs that sent blood streaming down his side. But Dalton was stronger than his lean frame suggested, and he brought the rifle butt around in a vicious arc that caught Moses across the temple. The escaped slave went down hard, his knife spinning away into the cypress roots. Dalton stood over him, blood flowing freely from his wounded side, his pale eyes burning with the fever of a man who'd never lost a fight. "Should have stayed hidden, boy," he gasped, raising the rifle for the killing shot. "Should have remembered what happens to slaves who forget their place." But Ruth was behind him now, her remaining knife pressed against his throat. "My turn," she whispered. "What would you do in that moment? Grant mercy to a man who'd shown none, or become the monster necessary to stop him? Because sometimes justice requires getting blood on your hands, and sometimes the only way to end a cycle of violence is to complete it with finality that even devils would understand. Ruth's blade trembled against Dalton's throat, a hair's breadth from ending 2 decades of terror with one decisive cut. But killing the monster wouldn't erase the system that had created him. And somewhere in the cypress shadows, more dangers were stirring to life. The swamp had fallen silent, except for the sound of water lapping against dead logs and the labored breathing of those still alive. David's body drifted face down near the cypress roots, his young blood mixing with ancient mud. Moses lay unconscious where Dalton's rifle butt had dropped him, a gash across his temple seeping red into the murky water. Rex whimpered from where Big Jim's bullet had caught him, while Brutus thrashed weakly in the shallows, Ruth's poison knife having done its work. Only Tracker remained unaccounted for, and that worried Big Jim more than anything else. The lean cur was Dalton's deadliest weapon, trained to kill silently and efficiently. The dog could be anywhere in the maze of cypress trunks and Spanish moss, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Dalton's pale eyes met Ruth's in the blade's reflection. Even with steel pressed to his jugular, the hunter's voice carried that same lazy confidence that had terrorized Burke County for years. "Go ahead, girl. Cut my throat. But ask yourself, what happens when word gets out that slaves are killing white men in broad daylight?" The question hung in the humid air like poison gas. They all knew the answer. Militia companies would sweep through every plantation, every settlement of free blacks, every suspected hiding place. The rebellion would be drowned in blood that would make Dalton's crimes seem merciful by comparison. "You think they'll stop with just you people?" Dalton continued, feeling the knife waver slightly. "Every plantation owner from here to Savannah will be calling for mass executions. Your Freedom Network, your safe houses, your Underground Railroad, all of it will burn. Justice becomes complicity sometimes." Ruth's hand shook, but not from fear. 20 years of accumulated rage warred with the cold calculation that had kept her alive since escaping slavery. David's death demanded retribution. Her husband's murder screamed for vengeance. But Dalton was right about one thing. Killing him here would unleash consequences that would destroy everything they'd built. Behind her, Samuel had managed to pull himself upright against the cypress trunk, his injured shoulder, making every movement agony. Joshua struggled to his feet in the deeper water, blood streaming from where Tracker's claws had raked his back. Big Jim stood waist-deep in the channel, the smoking pistol still in his hand, his eyes scanning the shadows for the missing dog. "There's another way," Samuel gasped, his voice barely audible, Don't have to kill him. Just gotta make sure he can't hunt no more." Ruth understood immediately. Her second knife, the one that had found Brutus, hadn't been coated with poison. It had been treated with something far more insidious, an extract from water hemlock that caused paralysis without death. She'd learned the recipe from a root doctor in the Okeefenokee, a woman who understood that sometimes mercy could be crueler than murder. The knife moved from Dalton's throat to his spine, the point finding the gap between vertebrae with surgical precision. "Hold still, Hunter," Ruth whispered. "This is going to hurt." But before she could drive the blade home, Tracker struck from the shadows. The cur had been circling through the cypress canopy, moving branch to branch with feline grace. His leap took him directly at Ruth's back. 70 pounds of trained killer aimed at her neck. Big Jim's second shot took the dog in midair, the bullet catching Tracker in the chest and spinning him into the water with a splash that sent ripples across the grove. The cur surfaced once, his yellow eyes already glazing over, then sank beneath the dark surface. The distraction lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Dalton twisted away from Ruth's knife, his hand finding the pistol at his belt. The weapon came up fast, its barrel swinging toward Big Jim's massive chest. Moses chose that moment to regain consciousness, his scarred hand closing around a chunk of cypress root. The wood caught Dalton across the wrist, sending the pistol spinning away into the deeper water. The hunter cursed and lunged for his rifle, but Joshua was closer, his hands closing around the weapon's stock. What followed was less a fight than a desperate scramble for survival. 4 people, all wounded, all exhausted, fighting over instruments of death and water that grew redder with each passing moment. Dalton's experience showed, even injured, even outnumbered, he moved with the efficiency of a man who'd killed professionally for 2 decades. But experience wasn't everything. These weren't random fugitives fleeing in panic. They were people who'd moved beyond fear into something far more dangerous, the absolute conviction that they had nothing left to lose. Ruth's knife found its mark at last, the blade sliding between Dalton's ribs with surgical precision. The hunter's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in surprise that someone had finally managed to wound him seriously. Blood frothed at his lips as he tried to speak, but the words came out as nothing more than a wet gurgle. The great Henry Dalton, terror of Georgia's plantation country, fell backward into water that was already stained with the blood of his victims. His pale eyes stared up at the Spanish moss, seeing perhaps for the first time the beauty of a world he'd spent his life destroying. But Ruth knew better than to assume the monster was dead. Dalton had survived too much, killed too many, to die from a single knife wound. Even now, she could see his chest rising and falling, his body fighting to survive as it had always done. The real question wasn't whether he would live or die. How do you kill a legend without creating a martyr? Because scattered throughout the Georgia backcountry were dozens of men who'd learned their trade from Henry Dalton, and news of his death would only inspire them to greater brutalities in his memory. Henry Dalton's body disappeared from the cypress grove sometime before dawn, leaving behind only blood-stained water and a mystery that would haunt Burke County for generations. The hunter's vanishing act would prove more terrifying than his death ever could have been. The survivors had made their decision in those final moments of twilight, as Spanish moss swayed in evening breezes that carried the scent of decay and dying things. Ruth knelt beside Dalton's still form, her fingers pressed to his neck, feeling the weak but steady pulse that confirmed what they all suspected. The man was too stubborn to die easily. His breathing came in shallow gasps, blood frothing at his lips with each exhale, but his pale eyes still tracked movement with predatory awareness. Moses, his head wound bandaged with strips torn from Joshua's shirt, studied the hunter's face in the fading light. "He's seen all our faces now," he said quietly. "Even if we let him live, he'll hunt us to the ends of the earth." Samuel, his injured shoulder bound tight against his chest, nodded toward the deeper water where Tracker's body had sunk from sight. "Man who trains dogs to taste human blood ain't never going to forgive us for killing his pack. But it was Big Jim who voiced what they were all thinking. Can't kill him. Can't let him live. What's left? Ruth smiled, the expression holding no warmth. She'd learned more than root medicine from the old woman in the Okeefenokee. Sometimes the best way to kill a legend is to make it disappear entirely. The plan they hatched in those dying moments of daylight was born from desperation and grandmother's wisdom combined. They would carry Dalton's unconscious form deeper into the swamp, to places where Spanish moss grew so thick it blocked out the sun, where water and land merged into a maze that could swallow whole armies without trace. Legends need witnesses to survive. There, in the heart of the Okeefenokee, lived communities that the outside world had forgotten: escaped slaves, Creek Indians, white deserters from various wars, all bound together by their shared invisibility. They had their own laws, their own justice, their own ways of dealing with men like Henry Dalton. As full darkness settled over the cypress grove, the survivors loaded the hunter's limp form into a dugout canoe that Ruth had hidden among the roots weeks earlier. His breathing had steadied, his pulse grown stronger, but consciousness remained beyond his reach. The root doctor's medicines were precise, enough to keep him alive for the journey ahead, not enough to allow him to wake and cause trouble. They paddled south through channels that existed only in the memory of those who'd learned to navigate by feel and instinct. Moses took point, his scarred hands working the paddle with silent efficiency. Ruth sat amidships, one hand resting on Dalton's chest to monitor his breathing. Behind them, Samuel, Joshua, and Big Jim followed in a second canoe, their own wounds forgotten in the urgency of what they were attempting. The Okeefenokee Swamp stretched across 400,000 acres of southeastern Georgia, a labyrinth of waterways and floating islands that shifted with the seasons. It was a place where maps lied and compasses spun uselessly, where the difference between solid ground and treacherous bog could only be determined by those who'd learned its secrets through blood and necessity. 3 hours after midnight, they reached their destination. The settlement had no name that appeared on any official document, just a collection of stilted cabins built on the few pieces of solid ground that existed in this watery wilderness. Perhaps 50 people called it home, bound together by the understanding that the outside world would destroy them if it ever learned they existed. The community's leader was a woman called Aunt Celia, though she claimed kinship to no one. Ancient beyond easy counting, her dark skin marked with ritual scars that spoke of Africa itself. She listened to their story, with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. When they'd finished, she studied Dalton's unconscious form with clinical interest. Hunter becomes hunted, she murmured in a voice like wind through dry leaves. Old story, older than America, older than slavery itself. Her decision came without consultation or debate. Henry Dalton would not die in her domain. When Henry, death was too merciful for one who'd caused such suffering. Instead, he would simply disappear. Not killed, not freed, but transformed into something the outside world could never understand or accept. The process began at dawn. Dalton was carried to a cabin built over the deepest part of the swamp, where cypress roots descended into black water that had no bottom anyone could measure. There, the old woman began her work with medicines that existed in no textbook, techniques that had been passed down through generations of people who understood that some forms of justice required patience measured in years rather than moments. When Dalton finally regained consciousness 3 days later, he found himself in a world that operated by completely different rules. His captors spoke languages he didn't recognize, followed customs that made no sense to his plantation-trained mind, lived lives that existed entirely outside the system he'd spent 2 decades enforcing. Most disturbing of all, they showed him no particular hostility. He was fed, his wounds were tended, his basic needs met with efficient care. But he was also watched constantly, and any attempt to leave was met with gentle but absolute prevention. The message was clear, without ever being spoken. Henry Dalton, terror of the Georgia backcountry, had simply vanished from the world he'd known. No dramatic death, no martyrdom to inspire followers, no body to provide closure to his victims. Just gone. What would drive a man like that to madness, faster, violent death, or realizing he'd become completely irrelevant? Because, as months turned to years in that nameless settlement, Henry Dalton would discover that the cruelest punishment for a man who'd built his identity on fear was to be forgotten entirely by the world he'd once terrorized. 5 years after Henry Dalton vanished into the Okeefenokee, plantation owners across Georgia began reporting sightings of a figure that couldn't possibly exist. The man they described bore Dalton's face, but moved like something that had forgotten how to be human. The first authenticated report came from the Riverside Plantation in 1814, where overseer James Crawford swore he'd seen the missing slave hunter standing at the edge of the cotton fields just before dawn. The figure wore the same leather vest, carried the same rifle, even sat astride what appeared to be the same black stallion. But when Crawford rode out to investigate, he found nothing but hoofprints that led to the swamp's edge and disappeared into black water. More sightings followed, each more unsettling than the last. A figure glimpsed through morning mist, always at the boundary between civilization and wilderness, never speaking, never pursuing, just watching. The reports came from plantations along the Altamaha River, the Oconee, the Ogeechee, waterways that connected to the vast Okeefenokee system where legends went to die or be reborn. The truth, known only to Aunt Celia and her closest allies, was both simpler and more complex than the ghost stories suggested. Henry Dalton lived, but the man who'd once terrorized Burke County had been systematically broken down and rebuilt according to principles that existed outside white understanding of justice or mercy. In the settlement that had no name, Dalton had spent 5 years learning what it meant to be powerless, fed only when he showed gratitude, clothed only when he demonstrated humility, allowed freedom of movement only when he proved he could be trusted not to abuse it. The process had been gentle but relentless, like water wearing away stone. Silence holds its own justice. From Aunt Celia's private journal, discovered in 1947, the hunter learns to be hunted. Pride becomes survival. Certainty becomes confusion. The man who thought he owned other people discovers what it means to be owned by consequences. But the old woman had made a miscalculation. She'd assumed that breaking Dalton's spirit would destroy his capacity for violence. Instead, it had created something far more dangerous. A man who understood the system from both sides, who knew intimately how power worked and how it could be subverted. Late one night in 1815, Dalton simply walked away from the settlement. No dramatic escape, no violence, no theft of supplies. He just stepped into his canoe and paddled north toward the world he'd once known. By the time anyone noticed his absence, he'd vanished into the maze of waterways like mist before sunrise. But the man who emerged from the Okeefenokee wasn't the same Henry Dalton who'd disappeared 5 years earlier. This version moved with different purpose, spoke in different rhythms, carried himself with a careful awareness of someone who'd learned to see the world through his victim's eyes. The ghost sightings weren't imagination or wishful thinking. They were reconnaissance. Dalton was studying the plantation system he'd once served, cataloging its weaknesses, identifying the men who'd profited from his work. He'd learned patience in the swamp settlement, learned to think in years rather than moments. Most disturbing of all, he'd learned to disappear. The first overseer died in his sleep at the Whitfield Plantation, the same estate where Dalton's final hunt had begun. No signs of violence, no evidence of poison, just a man who went to bed healthy and failed to wake up. The only unusual detail was a single magnolia blossom found on his windowsill, though no magnolia trees grew within miles of the house. 3 more deaths followed over the next 6 months, each occurring at plantations where Dalton had conducted hunts, each victim dying peacefully in their sleep with no obvious cause. The only connection was those magnolia blossoms, left like calling cards by someone who understood the power of fear. Judge Samuel Whitfield, the man who'd hired Dalton to track Samuel, Joshua, and Big Jim, was found in his study on Christmas morning, slumped over his desk with a half-finished letter to the governor requesting more slave hunters. The magnolia blossom lay across the unfinished words, its petals still fresh despite the December cold. The plantation system began to fracture as word spread of the mysterious deaths. Overseers quit their positions, moving to other counties or abandoning the profession entirely. Some plantation owners hired guards, others installed better locks. A few even freed their enslaved workers rather than risk whatever was stalking the Georgia backcountry. But Henry Dalton, if the figure was indeed the vanished hunter, remained as elusive as smoke. Sightings continued, always brief, always at the margins of vision. A horseman glimpsed through morning fog, a silhouette standing beneath Spanish moss, a figure that looked like the devil's own memory of justice delayed. Ruth, now running a school for freed children in Savannah, heard the stories with mixed emotions. Part of her took satisfaction in the fear that gripped the men who'd once seemed untouchable, but another part wondered what they'd truly unleashed when they delivered Dalton to Aunt Celia's tender mercies. Moses, working as a carpenter in Charleston, received occasional letters from contacts in the Georgia interior. The slave hunting industry was dying, he learned, not from legal action or moral awakening, but from simple terror. Who would take up such work when even the most successful practitioners ended up dead or disappeared? The network they'd built to oppose Dalton had evolved into something larger, an underground system that helped escape slaves, documented plantation crimes, and occasionally delivered justice that the legal system would never provide. They called themselves the Cypress Circle, in honor of the grove where everything had changed. By 1820, the sightings had stopped. No more ghost stories, no more mysterious deaths, no more magnolia blossoms left as calling cards. Henry Dalton, whether man or legend, had vanished as completely as he'd appeared. Some say he returned to the Okeefenokee, dying peacefully among the people who'd taught him what mercy looked like. Others claim he headed west, applying his hard-earned lessons to different frontiers where justice wore different faces. A few insist he never left Georgia at all, that somewhere in the vast network of rivers and swamps, an old man still watches the boundaries between freedom and bondage. What would you believe? That monsters can be redeemed, or that some sins leave stains too deep for any amount of swamp water to wash clean? Even today, local historians in southeastern Georgia speak of the phantom hunter, a figure glimpsed in early morning mist, riding the boundaries between past and present, reminding anyone who listen that every system built on suffering eventually produces its own destruction. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.